Sorry about that. That's okay. I actually had a class where I pulled up the wrong lecture, and they're like, "This is it." I'm like, "Oh God, yeah, okay." So at least I didn't get that far today. Okay, so we talked last week a bit about elections in Texas. We talked about things like why people don't vote, some of the things that go into campaigns. Today we're going to talk about money, different types of elections, and so on. All right, so obviously for candidates, the biggest thing that drives a campaign is money. You have to raise the money, you have to spend the money, and as soon as you run out of money, you're in a lot of trouble. So most of the money that goes into state elections is coming from wealthy donors, people who own construction companies, car dealerships, lawyers, so people who are generally wealthy, special interests like telecommunications, and so on. And money does make candidates beholden to special interests. If you're constantly getting funding from law enforcement agencies, you're not going to want to be seen as soft on crime. So you're going to take a stance to be a little bit tougher, a little bit harder than you would if you weren't beholden to law enforcement. Some elections, money isn't the deciding factor. In these elections, it's usually because the voters are feeling something. If they're very angry, if they're very worried, then the amount of money spent isn't going to decide the election. 2008, Republicans spent a huge amount of money, but because the voters across the states were blaming Republicans for the collapse of the economy, a lot of them lost. They spent the money, but the voters weren't happy. So when voter emotion is strong, money doesn't necessarily decide the election, but that's pretty rare. Voters have to have some pretty strong feelings for that to be the case. But what happens with this in a lot of ways is it does lead to an illiberal democracy. The majority of the state representatives, state senate, as well as on the national level, are represented by the wealthy, by people with advanced degrees in fields like law, MBAs, and so on. So a small group of people control public policy. Millionaires and billionaires are not a significant part of our population, but they are overrepresented in government on pretty much every level. But it's twofold. We don't like that we're represented by the wealthy, but the candidates themselves don't like fundraising. It's humiliating, right? It's humiliating to go back and say, thank you for electing me, now give me more money. It's a pain in the neck to constantly have to fundraise, to not have money on hand. And in 1990, a survey was done that found that 65% of Texas candidates supported public funding. If we made it so that state elections were funded through tax dollars and public donations, candidates wouldn't have to fundraise, less wealthy individuals could run for office, and we would remove some of that special interest involvement in the political process. It's not going to make the system perfect, but it would be a huge improvement on how people are able to run, how they're able to get elected. curiosity, how many of you would consider maybe running for state office if you didn't have to fundraise, if someone gave you the money to do it? Maybe. I consider it, right? Why not? Okay, now there are some regulations on funding. On the federal level, in 1971, Congress passed the Revenue Act. And what this did is when you file your tax return, you can choose to give part of your return to the presidential election campaign fund. So you can give up to $3 of your tax return as an individual and $6 as a married couple. So you can choose to give part of your tax return to help fund presidential candidates who decide to accept public funding. There's also the Federal Election Campaign Act. We have a Federal Election Commission, the FEC, and it requires candidates to say how much money they've taken in, the expenses for their campaigns, and made it so you can only donate a maximum of $1,000 to a campaign. Now, there's no limit on how many candidates you can donate to, but there is a limit on the amount of money you can give as an individual. In Texas, they also tried to pass reform in the 1973 Act. What this would have done, what it did do, is require every candidate to have a campaign treasurer. You need someone to be tracking the money, to see how much are you taking in, how much are you spending, and is it going where it's supposed to? Also, if you get a donation of over $500 from a group that's out of state, you are required to name the contributors. So basically, if you accept money from, let's say, the Democratic Party of New Mexico, anyone who gives you a $100 donation has to be named by law. And you are required to file financial reports. There was a provision that there would be a civil or criminal penalty, but there was no enforcement, no provision for how to enforce it. It was basically assuming that candidates would self-report if they broke the law, which, as we know, not that likely, right? Most people aren't going to say, yes, I broke the law, come after me. So they made a reform in 1991 where they created an ethics commission. And they could hear complaints about someone violating the law, someone violating state campaign rules. They can levy a fine, and if it's really blatant, like outright bribery, they can refer the case to the Travis County DA. But you need 6 out of 8 members of the commission to take action. And basically, all they've really done is issued fines. So if you break the law on campaigns in Texas, more likely than not, you're just going to have to pay a fine, and that's the end of it. There's no real legal enforcement of the violations of state campaign laws. And there are 2 types of money we tend to see being spent on elections: hard and soft money. Hard money is campaign funding, money you give directly to a candidate. So if you buy a Trump hat or a sign for your yard for Biden Harris, that's a direct contribution to the campaign. That's considered hard money. Soft money, on the other hand, goes directly to the party. So if you donate to the Democratic National Committee and then they turn around and spend the money, it's considered soft money, and it's not as strictly regulated. And in 2010, the Supreme Court basically said soft money that comes from political action committees cannot be limited. As long as a donor is not directly coordinating their actions with the party, they can donate as much money as they want to a political party. So there aren't that many restrictions on indirect contributions. We're keeping track of direct campaign contributions, but not necessarily indirect contributions. And it's soft money that really determines if a candidate's going to win. Because the more money you bring in, the more likely you are to win. It's why presidential candidates sometimes spend upwards of $1 billion during the presidential election cycle. Okay. We do also tend to see what's called negative campaigning, right? We've all seen political ads where it's an attack on a candidate, accusing them of being dishonest, corrupt, mentally ill, unfaithful to their spouse, financially dishonest, or even calling someone a Satanist. And 80% of campaign ads for the House in 2006 were negative. The majority of campaign ads do tend to be negative. And there's a psychological reason for that. We remember the negative ads more than we remember the positive ones. So there's 4 impacts that negative ads have on us. The first is that sometimes an election is decided by inaccurate information. If all you see is a set of ads calling a candidate a liar and a thief, you're not going to vote for that candidate. You're going to think there's some truth to that. The second problem is that we don't see as much discussion on policy, right? If all people are doing is throwing mud at each other and name calling, then the discussions we need to hear on immigration, taxes, roads, schools, etc., get tossed out the window. And we don't get the information that we need. We don't really know where a candidate stands on the issue. We just know that someone called them a liar. The third problem is it does discourage people from running for office. most people don't necessarily want to take a chance on someone dragging them and their family through the mud. So, for example, in the 1972 presidential election, the vice presidential candidate originally was a man named Tom Eagleton. It came out that Eagleton had electroshock therapy for depression. Now, something like that should probably be off limits, but the presidential candidate was so worried about how this would be perceived that he had to drop him from the ticket. And who would want to run if someone was digging into your past, right? If everything you did wrong was thrown back at you, you probably wouldn't want to run for office. And the last problem is it also decreases voter turnout. The more nasty a campaign gets, the worse voter turnout is going to be. It can decrease voter turnout by about 5%. Take a look at 2016, right? One of the ugliest elections in recent history, and most people stayed home. They were sick of the mudslinging, they were sick of the fighting, they were sick of the ugliness, and so they said, I don't care anymore. I'm staying home on election day. So while we do remember negative ads, they also have the side effect of making us not want to show up on election day, of making us say, you know what, I'm out. I don't want to do this. I can't bring myself to vote for either one of you because you both suck. Given that we're a little over a month away from the general election, the negative ads are going to start pouring in at this point. All right, so in an election year, the first election that we hold is called a primary election. And primaries are where we choose the candidates to run in the general election. Now, we usually hold the primary on the second Tuesday in March. This year, we took part in Super Tuesday, so it got moved up a little bit. And again, here in Texas, well, actually, we used to hold the primary in May, and then we said, well, we're not actually part of the decision-making process, so we moved it up to March. And again, it is a semi-open primary. You do not have to register with a party, but if you voted in the Democratic primary this year, you could only participate in a Democratic Party runoff or Democratic Party activity like a convention. And then you'd be identified as a Democrat until the end of the year. In the next election, if you then voted Republican, you would only be able to participate in Republican activities. So it gives independents a little bit of a chance to participate, but if they don't want to be identified with a party, even temporarily, they're going to sit out the primaries. And again, we used to have our primary in May, but usually by the end of April, we know who the presidential candidates are going to be. So we moved up the primary so we could be part of the discussion. So we could have an impact on choosing the presidential candidate. And it's up to the county party members to make sure everything is set for a primary. You need polling places, schools, libraries, churches, buildings that can have multiple polling stations. You need to make sure you have voting machines. Right, you gotta have the machines working, there needs to be enough machines, and so on. And they need to help determine the results. And so the way they pay for this is through the use of a filing fee. If you're gonna run for a local seat, it's about $50. If you're running for president or senate, you're paying a $5,000 fee. So filing fees help cover the cost of the election. You'll also need a presiding judge and some election clerks to make sure the election is going fairly. You don't want people engaging in voter suppression, misinformation, tossing out ballots, things like that. So you don't want an election essentially being stolen. You don't want someone looking at a person and saying, oh, well, they're a Republican, they can't vote. Or they're a Democrat, let's toss out their vote. You gotta make sure it's an open and fair process. And that's why they ask for volunteers on election day. People to help supervise the polls, make sure voters are getting accurate information, that someone isn't being denied the right to vote, and so on. Making sure people are in the right precinct. All of that's important on election day. Alright, so the general election is held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. Don't ask me why, there's no real logical reason, that's just how it's always been. So, our next election is November 3rd. And this is where we choose who's going to serve in office. So the Secretary of State is in charge of the general election. You want to make sure that the process goes smoothly, that the votes are properly counted, that if there is a challenge or a recount, that the Secretary of State knows about it. So when you go in and look at the ballot, it does tend to vary by county, but usually it goes from highest office to lowest. So this year it will go president, senate, and so on. When it's not a presidential election, it will be governor, and then on down the list. And the candidates whose party won the last governor's race get elected first. So this year on the ballot, it will be Republican candidates first, then Democrats, Libertarian, and so on. And of course, for most people, they'll vote usually at the top of the ticket and not at the bottom. Most voters are concerned about who's governor or president, not who's on the school board. So some people go all the way through the ballot, and some take a couple of elections and call it a day. There is also space for a write-in candidate. In 2016, there were some people who voted for Harambe the gorilla for president. Obviously not a valid write-in candidate, but you could write someone in if you don't like either one of the candidates. Constitutional amendments, if there are any, are listed separately, but because our state legislature meets in odd-numbered years, we hold those elections in a different time. For local races like mayor and city council, those are held in the spring, not in the fall. They're also not partisan. There's no party label next to the candidate. So it tends to suppress or depress voter turnout. For most people, they don't know much about their local mayoral or city council candidate. So if they vote, usually people vote by party. You can't do that in a nonpartisan election, so most people don't bother to vote. There's information, but you kind of have to look for it. So for a lot of people, they're like, not worth it. And a lot of the election work is done at the county level. The counties have to find the early polling stations, decide where to hold the election, get people to volunteer on election day. So most of the work's done at the county level. It goes up to the state level, but most of it's Hidalgo, Cameron counties, etc. Okay, now there are some special elections in Texas. We can hold a special election if there's a vacancy in Congress. So if a representative resigns, dies, or takes a position in a different branch of government, we have to have a special election to fill that seat. Same with the state legislature. If a member of the state House of Representatives quits, then an election has to be held to fill the seat. Our state constitutional amendments are usually a special election as well. And because special elections are held at irregular times, and of course not every year necessarily, it does tend to lead to low voter turnout. We don't tend to see as much participation in amending the state constitution. So for example, in September of 2013, there was a vote on Proposition 12 to cap medical malpractice awards. Only 13% of voters participated, and it passed. So it's a very, very low number of voters who are amending the state constitution. Of course, those laws are binding on all of us. So we should be seeing higher voter turnout for a constitutional amendment, but it's usually less than 15%. With early voting, it can be done about 2 weeks before the election, sometimes a little longer. It can be done at a county clerk's office or an early polling station. So the county should be announcing soon where the early voting is going to be for the presidential election. In 2018, one of the early polling places was here on campus, in the campus library. So if you know you're not going to be able to vote on election day because of work, travel, school, etc., you can take advantage of early voting. With early voting, you can vote at any early voting station in your county. On election day, you can only vote in your precinct. But if you're early voting anywhere in your county, you're allowed to vote. And 2/3 of the voters here vote early. It's easier, right? If you can go and vote on a Saturday and you don't have to take the time off of work, why not? In 2018, if a polling place on campus, how much easier does it get, right? In between classes, walk over to the library, vote, walk back. Pretty easy. So for most people, taking advantage of early voting is a benefit. And we will likely see a huge number of people taking advantage this year because they don't want to wait in line on election day in the middle of a pandemic. Okay, so in terms of some of the elections that we've seen in Texas history, in 1994, Democrats lost control of the state. Essentially, there was a lot of anger towards the Democrats on a national level, and it had an impact here in Texas. George W. Bush won the governor's race. Republicans picked up a Senate seat. And they won more than 900 local elections. So this is when Republicans gained control of the state, where we saw it going from a Democratic-controlled state to a mix to Republican-dominated. And there was redistricting done in 2003 that gave the Republican Party an advantage in terms of state elections. So today, Texas is largely controlled by the Republican Party. Now again, that may change, right? The state is changing, identity is changing. These things come and go. The Republican domination may come to an end. We don't know. What Democrats have done to try and win elections is to nominate minority candidates to increase minority turnout. They nominated an African American for Senate in 2002, a Mexican American for governor, and a white man for lieutenant governor. So they're hoping to get minority turnout increased by running minority candidates. That didn't work. By and large, we do see more white Texans showing up to vote compared to minorities. The Democrats need to come up with a new strategy to try and get minorities to the polls. And in 2002, we had a very, very ugly gubernatorial election between Rick Perry and Sanchez, who was the Democrat. So the Sanchez campaign ran an ad with a clip of Governor Perry's motorcade being pulled over, and Governor Perry basically saying, "I'm the governor, just let me go, give me a break." So, which is fair game, right? There's this clip, it's out there. But the Perry campaign retaliated by running an ad accusing Sanchez of money laundering for Mexican cartels and being involved in the murder of a DEA agent in 1985. No proof whatsoever. So they really, really went overboard. You get mad saying the governor was trying to claim special privilege, and then you accuse your opponent of being a murderer. That's a bit of overkill. Also, there's absolutely no proof he was engaged in money laundering or anything of the like. And the unfortunate thing about negative ads is they don't necessarily have to be true. They just have to scare people. In 2016, the NRA ran an ad saying Hillary Clinton was going to take away your guns. No proof, but basically using it as a scare tactic. Okay, in 2012, Barack Obama managed to win re-election, but Democrats were not able to take back control of the House of Representatives, which they'd lost in 2010. And it was here that we saw the rise of Tea Party candidates at the state level. The Tea Party was basically fiscal conservatives complaining that Republicans were not conservative enough, that they weren't doing enough to demand a balanced budget, a decrease in the government spending, and so on. And this is where Ted Cruz was first elected. He wasn't supposed to win his primary against the lieutenant governor because he was a Tea Party candidate, but he won. And so some Republicans began moving more to the right to counterbalance the Tea Party, to argue that they were every bit as conservative. So this is where we really saw Texas Republicans moving closer to the right, out of fear because of the election like Ted Cruz. And it's likely that Republicans will continue to dominate the state unless Democrats can find a way to get minorities to the polls. If minorities vote in large enough numbers, Democrats could take back some of the state positions. But for whatever reason, Democrats can't seem to come up with a strategy to get minorities out to the polls. And part of the problem with their strategy of let's nominate minority candidates was it was seen as pandering, right? Oh, you want our votes, you'll nominate a token Mexican American or African American. And the people were kind of insulted by that, right? Oh, you're only nominating them to try and get our vote. Okay. 2016, there was about 51.6% voter turnout, 49th worst voter turnout nationally. So we weren't the worst, but yeah, we were towards the bottom. What was interesting was the margin of victory for Donald Trump was only 9%. That was the closest it's been in recent history. So there was some surprise among pundits that it was that close in Texas. They honestly thought the margin of victory would be larger. So it was kind of a surprise to them that it wasn't. We did see 3.2% voting for the Libertarian candidate, which shows here in Texas there's a strong Libertarian streak. They are a fairly viable third party here in Texas. Not usually that strong. So it did show there's a bit of a Libertarian streak in Texas. The state Senate became evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, but the state house is still controlled by the Republicans. So a little bit of change in the state Senate, but not in the state house. Of course, part of the reason voter turnout was low, again, is because nobody liked the candidates. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump were the two most disliked candidates in modern history. For the most part, you weren't voting for Hillary Clinton, you were voting against Donald Trump, and vice versa. Neither side had a very large group of diehards, right? Both sides were kind of like, most voters were like, I don't like either one of them, but I guess I'll hold my nose and vote for this person. The voter turnout overall was lower in 2016. There's a lot of people not happy about what they were seeing on the national level. And of course, as we all know, Donald Trump did win the Electoral College, but not the popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by about 3 million votes, but she lost the Electoral College, so that's why Trump became president. Okay, so that brings us to the most recent election, 2018. People had some pretty strong feelings going into the election, both for and against President Trump. So nationally, the voter turnout was about 53%, which is 19% higher compared to the 2014 midterm elections. So more people showed up to vote, including here in Texas. We saw higher voter turnout compared to previous elections. So Democrats took back control of the National House of Representatives, but not the Senate, although the Senate is pretty evenly divided, which is why we're seeing such a deadlock in Congress, right? Democrats in the House don't want to work with Republicans in the Senate and vice versa. On the state level, Republicans continued to dominate. It wasn't even a close election for governor. Governor Abbott overwhelmingly won re-election. Although, to be honest, I think if the election were being held this November, it'd be a lot closer. Right? There's some people who are frustrated with the response of the state government to COVID. But nonetheless, he's not up for re-election until 2022. Senate-wise, of course, it was close, closer than they anticipated. Ted Cruz did manage to hold on to his seat, again, partly because white voter turnout was significantly higher compared to minority voter turnout. So Cruz managed to hold on to his seat, but it wasn't a major victory for him. It was pretty close. He could have lost. So now the question becomes, what's going to happen in November? Are we going to see more participation in the state? It was announced recently that Texas has had the highest number of new voters registering in the country. So we are seeing a massive increase in voter registration. But that doesn't mean people are going to show up at the polls. The higher number of registrations needs to correlate to more participation to really make a difference. So it's helpful and it's a good sign that people are registering to vote, but they do have to show up on election day. And then the question is also, will John Cornyn hold on to his seat? It's pretty close right now between Cornyn and Hager. It's also pretty close between Trump and Biden. Some polls show Biden slightly in the lead, others show Texas very close. That's pretty rare. Usually they put Texas squarely in the Republican column, but they can't really do that this year. So if somehow Biden manages to win Texas, there's going to have to be a whole lot of discussion about what we're seeing, right? Because if the state becomes blue in this election, is that a predictor for future elections? Could Texas become a swing state? Could we see more interest in Texas voters? Because for too long, I feel like Republicans have taken advantage of it, said, well, we're going to win, and Democrats haven't done enough to try to win in Texas. So if it's really close this time, I think both parties are going to have to take another look at Texas and say, we can't take it for granted anymore. We can't assume we're going to win or lose, which wouldn't be a bad thing. Okay, any questions on that? All right, so since we have a few minutes, show of hands, how many of you voted in the 2018 election? Okay. How many of you are planning to vote in this election? How many of you think it doesn't make a difference if I vote or not, so why bother? Ish. Okay. So, why do you think people don't vote? Why is it that people look at it and go, whatever? Okay, think their vote doesn't count. Sure, because of the Electoral College, right? They think, well, we don't actually pick the president, so why should I bother? My one vote isn't going to make a difference. Yeah, sure. That's definitely part of it. What else? What about the candidates? Do they think they actually represent Texas voters? Sort of, kind of, not really. Yeah. I think it's hard to feel like they're actually representing us if they're wealthy, older, and so on, right? It's hard to feel like someone who's a millionaire actually cares about people who are surviving on minimum wage. That's a part of it. How many of you would consider voting if election day was a federal holiday, if you didn't have to go to work or school? Wouldn't make a difference. All right, that's fair. Oh, that's fair. That's fair. Do you think it would make a difference though overall? Do you think more people might show up to vote if it was a federal holiday? Maybe. I mean, that's what they do in a lot of countries, is they make it a federal holiday. And there's no reason why it couldn't be here, right? If you want people to show up to vote, if you hold the election on a Tuesday, you should probably just make it a federal holiday. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to hold an election on a Tuesday when people have work, school, and responsibilities. So I'd say either move it to a weekend or make it a federal holiday. Okay. What about those of you online? Any thoughts on this? Okay, I'll say this. I do understand why you may not feel like your vote matters, why you may think it doesn't make a difference. And yeah, logically, one vote doesn't. But if a million people stay home on election day, then what? Right? If a million Texans decide not to vote, then what? If only 50% of the registered voters show up, then what? Right? So, on the one hand, yes, logically, your one vote won't make a difference. But if you're part of a group of people who show up on election day, who decide, you know what, we've been sitting on the sidelines for too long, we've been ignored, we've been marginalized, we're going to tell the powers that be that we're here and they have to deal with us. That could make a difference. When people don't show up to vote, and the side effect of that is that the people who do show up to vote, people who are 55 and older, have more of a say in policy. So if you really want to see changes, if you really want to see more affordable college, better health care, etc., you have to vote. We have to get young people to the polls. If you want to be taken seriously by the people in charge, y'all have to show up to vote. Because you have to show them you're serious. You have to show them you're not going to be taken for granted. You're not going to be pushed to the sides and marginalized anymore. If a ton of young people show up to vote in this election, you could scare the hell out of the people in charge. And quite frankly, I think they could use a good scaring. So just keep that in mind. Okay.